I won $47 million on my 34th birthday, and I told no one. Not my parents, not my siblings, not the people who had taken from me for years and called it love. Before the money ever touched my hands, I ran one quiet test, and it showed me exactly who would stand beside me when I had nothing left to give. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through quiet betrayals that didn't leave bruises but still changed who you are, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I used to believe that a good life was built from small, careful habits. Pay your bills on time, answer emails politely, bring a covered dish to family gatherings. Don't ask for too much, don't expect too much. I lived that way for most of my adult life, tucked into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Portland, the kind of place with thin walls and a persistent hum from the refrigerator that never quite shut off. I was 34 and an accountant, which meant my year revolved around tax seasons that swallowed 60 hours a week and left me eating dinners out of plastic containers under fluorescent office lights. It also meant that every unexpected expense, a transmission repair, a medical copay, a rent increase, felt like a personal failure rather than bad luck. My student loans were a quiet shadow that followed me everywhere. I didn't talk about them much. I told myself everyone had debt, that it was temporary, that someday I'd look back and laugh. But in the present, it pressed down on me in small, humiliating ways, like calculating groceries to the dollar or choosing gas over a haircut. I drove a 12-year-old Toyota Corolla with a dented bumper and a radio that only picked up one station if you held it just right. I didn't hate my life, but I didn't feel free inside it either. I felt contained. Family, for me, had always been complicated in a way that didn't show up in holiday photos. My parents divorced when I was in college, the kind of divorce that came with forced smiles and sharp silences. My father, Gregory, remarried a woman named Stephanie, who spoke in soft managerial tones and liked to offer advice disguised as concern. My mother, Diane, remarried a wealthy real estate investor named Warren, and overnight her language changed. She began saying things like our lake house and the markets, as if money were a weather system she had finally learned to predict. I was the middle child in practice, even though I was the youngest. My sister Lisa was 4 years younger than me, but somehow always seemed ahead. An Ivy League graduate, married to Paul, a surgeon with a steady smile, and a schedule booked months in advance. They had 2 children and a house that looked like it had been staged even when it wasn't. My brother Jason was older than me by 2 years and lived in a perpetual state of reinvention. New jobs, new relationships, new promises. He spoke about potential the way other people spoke about weather, always changing, never his fault. Then there were the aunts. Aunt Heather, who had married into money and carried it like armor, and Aunt Martha, my mother's older sister, a retired school teacher who lived in a small bungalow and still clipped coupons with careful hands. Aunt Martha had always smelled faintly of lavender and chalk dust, even after she stopped teaching. She asked real questions and waited for the answers. I learned early not to mix family and money, but not because anyone taught me. I learned because I paid for the lesson myself. When Jason called me crying about rehab, I wired him $5,000 without hesitation, telling myself this was what sisters did. He never went. When Lisa asked me to help with wedding expenses, I gave her $2,000, which she promised to repay after the honeymoon. 5 years passed, then children, then renovations, and the money disappeared into the polite silence between us. When my father needed money for roof repairs, I wrote a check only to see photos weeks later of him and Stephanie on a beach vacation, cocktails raised to a sunset I hadn't paid to see. Each time I told myself it was the last time. Each time I hardened just a little more, like clay left out too long. I stopped offering, I stopped lending, I learned how to say I can't right now without flinching. It made me feel smaller but safer. The one place I let myself imagine something different was a weekly ritual that cost $10 and bought me a few minutes of quiet hope. Every Friday after work, I stopped at Gus's Market, a corner store that smelled like coffee and old newspapers, and bought a ticket. The cashier never mocked me, but my family did when it came up, laughing gently as if indulging a child. I didn't tell them that I wasn't dreaming of mansions or yachts. I was dreaming of breathing without counting. On my 34th birthday, I worked a full day and came home to a microwave dinner and a card from my mother signed with both her name and Warren's. It was polite. On a whim, I stopped at Gus's and bought 2 tickets instead of 1. I picked the same numbers I always did, numbers tied to people and moments that mattered to me. I folded the tickets and slid them into my wallet, then forgot about them for 2 days. When I checked the numbers, standing in my kitchen with the refrigerator humming and the evening light fading, my first reaction wasn't joy. It was disbelief so sharp it felt like nausea. I checked again and again. I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet and pressed my palms into my eyes until I saw stars. $47 million. After taxes, roughly 28. The number didn't feel real, it felt dangerous. That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't scream or cry. I lay in bed listening to my own breathing and thought about everything I had ever seen money do to people. The arguments, the entitlement, the way love turned conditional. By morning, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I would not tell them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I spent the next week reading everything I could about lottery winners who lost everything: bankruptcy, lawsuits, estrangement. I met with an attorney named Philip Montgomery, whose office smelled like leather and paper. He spoke calmly about blind trusts and anonymity, about moving slowly and not sharing news prematurely. I nodded and listened and felt something settle inside me, a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. I continued my life as if nothing had changed. I went to work, I drove my Toyota, I answered emails, but underneath I was building something invisible. And before I allowed the money to change my life in any visible way, I decided to run one quiet test. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I needed to know who would show up for me when I offered nothing but myself. I called my best friend first. She listened without interrupting, then warned me that tests could hurt people. I understood. I also told her that I was tired of guessing. I called my family and told them I had lost my job, that I was struggling, that I needed $5,000 to cover rent and medical bills. I asked 10 people. I waited. The first person I called was my mother. I chose a Tuesday evening because I knew Warren would be home, and part of me wanted him to hear it too. My voice shook just enough to sound real, though the fear underneath it wasn't entirely fake. I told her I'd been laid off unexpectedly. I told her my savings wouldn't stretch as far as I'd hoped. I paused before I asked, letting the silence do some of the work. When I finally said the number, $5,000, it came out softer than I intended. There was a moment of sympathy, the kind that lives in tone rather than action. She said she was sorry, that this must be so stressful. I could hear Warren murmuring something in the background. Then she sighed and said things were tight right now. The lake house down payment had taken more than they planned. Warren controlled most of the finances anyway. She suggested I talk to my father or maybe Lisa and Paul. When we hung up, my hand felt numb around the phone, like I'd been holding it too tightly for too long. My father was next. He listened in silence while I explained, and for a moment I thought he might surprise me. Then he cleared his throat and began a lecture about budgeting, about emergency funds, about how this experience would build character. Stephanie chimed in with a reminder that they were on a fixed retirement income and couldn't jeopardize their future. I thanked them for the advice and hung up feeling smaller than when I'd called. Aunt Elisa answered on the second ring. She sounded genuinely shocked, her voice dropping as if she didn't want the children to hear. She said she was so sorry that she wished I'd told her sooner. For a few minutes, I felt something loosen in my chest. Then she began listing expenses, a new car, tuition, a remodel they'd already committed to. She offered to let me stay in their guest room, though it was currently full. She suggested Paul might have ideas. She never offered the money. When we said goodbye, her voice was careful, like someone closing a door quietly. Jason didn't call at all. He texted back hours later with 2 words, really tight. I replied once, then twice. No response. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, remembering every time I'd stepped in without hesitation. Aunt Heather called me herself, which I hadn't expected. She spoke for 20 minutes without letting me interrupt, delivering a monologue about self-reliance and the dangers of depending on others. She told me she'd heard rumors about layoffs and that it didn't bode well for my industry. I realized midway through that she had already told others. When she hung up, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. My cousin Ryan texted with exaggerated sympathy and suggested we meet. I knew better, but I agreed. He canceled an hour before, then disappeared entirely. By the 3rd day, I stopped checking my phone with hope. The silence itself became an answer. Then, on the 4th day, Aunt Martha called. She didn't ask questions right away. She asked if I'd eaten. She asked where I was. She asked if I could meet her for lunch. When I arrived, she slid an envelope across the table without ceremony. $3,000, nearly all her savings, I knew. She told me I could sleep on her sofa if I needed to. She told me not to worry about paying her back. That night, I cried in a way I hadn't since childhood. Not because of the money, but because of the clarity. 9 people had found reasons. 1 had found a way. A week later, I told Aunt Martha the truth about the test. She listened quietly, then told me about her ex-husband forging her signature years ago to steal her inheritance. She said money showed people who they already were. When I told her about the lottery, she laughed softly and said she was content with her small life. She refused help beyond a stipend for her health, and only after I insisted. I called a family meeting under the pretense of clearing the air. I told them I'd found a new job, a non-profit role. I pointed out calmly how they responded. There were excuses, no apologies. Relief flickered when they realized there would be no handout. I kept my secret. I set boundaries. I helped quietly where it mattered. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. After the family meeting, something inside me settled into a quiet resolve. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity, the kind that doesn't demand confrontation or validation, the kind that simply adjusts your expectations and moves forward without asking permission. I stopped waiting for my phone to light up with messages that would never come. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I let the silence be what it was. On the surface, my life looked almost exactly the same. I still drove the Corolla. I still lived in my 1-bedroom apartment. I still showed up to work on time and nodded through meetings where my boss, Arnold, took credit for ideas that had started on my notepad. Derek still wandered in late with coffee and excuses. No one suspected anything. But behind the scenes, Philippe and I were building a structure that felt both invisible and solid. A blind trust, conservative investments, a charitable arm that would one day become something real. The hardest part was learning to move slowly. Every instinct in me wanted to fix everything at once, pay off debts, quit my job, buy a house. But Philippe reminded me that haste invited questions, and questions invited attention. So I practiced patience the way some people practice meditation. I learned how to sit with abundance without announcing it. I began quietly paying off my student loans, one anonymous transfer at a time. I covered medical bills for my father when I learned about his heart condition, routing the money through a foundation so he never knew it was me. When Ryan finally entered rehab months later, I ensured the fees were covered, no strings attached. I didn't call. I didn't wait for gratitude. I did it because I could, and because I wanted to, not because I needed recognition. Aunt Martha and I grew closer. I bought a modest house near her bungalow through the trust, close enough that I could check on her without making a production of it. She teased me about becoming a lady of leisure, and I laughed, knowing how little my daily life had changed. I set up a stipend for her health and retirement, framed as a teaching grant in her name. She accepted that. Eventually, I left my job. I told people I'd been offered a role directing a small nonprofit focused on isolated seniors. It wasn't entirely a lie. The nonprofit existed because I built it. Charlotte joined me, bringing her warmth and organizational genius. We started small, matching volunteers with seniors who needed companionship. The work grounded me. It gave my days shape and meaning that spreadsheets never had. My family watched from a distance. They praised my career success without curiosity. Holidays became polite and brief. I no longer felt the need to explain myself or bridge gaps they hadn't tried to cross. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the girl I had been, the one who believed endurance was the same as love. I wished I could tell her that money wouldn't save her, but it would show her the truth, that boundaries weren't cruelty, that generosity without self-respect was just another kind of loss. The lottery didn't give me a new life overnight. It gave me the space to choose one deliberately. And in that quiet choice, I found something I'd been missing all along: peace. Peace, I learned, doesn't arrive with fireworks. It settles in gradually, like dust after a storm, coating everything so softly you don't notice it until you realize the air feels lighter. That was how my new life unfolded. There was no dramatic reveal, no moment where I stood in front of a mirror and saw a different person. Instead, there were mornings when I woke up without dread curling in my stomach. There were evenings when I didn't calculate tomorrow's anxiety before turning off the light. Running the nonprofit changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, I thought I was doing good because I had the means, but sitting across from elderly men and women who hadn't had a visitor in weeks, sometimes months, stripped away any illusion that this was charity in the abstract. I listened to stories that had nowhere else to go. A retired machinist whose children stopped calling after his wife died. A former librarian who kept her husband's shoes by the door because moving them felt like betrayal. Their loneliness wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and constant, the kind that erodes you from the inside. And every time I showed up, every time Charlotte matched someone with a volunteer who genuinely cared, I felt a sense of rightness that no paycheck had ever given me. Charlotte became my anchor. She never treated my wealth like a spectacle or a solution. She treated it like a responsibility. We argued sometimes about how fast to grow, about safeguards, about burnout, but our arguments were rooted in mutual respect, not entitlement. I trusted her in a way I hadn't trusted anyone outside myself in years. She reminded me gently when I overextended, when my instinct to fix threatened to override my instinct to listen. My family, meanwhile, continued exactly as before, only now I observed them with a different lens. When Jason resurfaced after rehab, he spoke about new beginnings and accountability. I nodded and wished him well. He asked for nothing, perhaps sensing the boundary even if he didn't understand it. Lisa shared photos of her children's milestones and spoke about stress with the same breathless urgency she'd always used, as if life were a series of emergencies that only ever affected her household. My parents aged quietly. My father's health stabilized. My mother spoke often about travel plans that never quite materialized. There were moments when the secret felt heavy. When someone complained about money in a way that felt performative, I had to swallow responses that would have changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. I learned restraint in a new way, not as deprivation, but as discernment. Not every truth needed to be shared. Some truths were meant to be lived. One afternoon, months into this new rhythm, Aunt Martha and I sat on her small porch watching the light fade. She asked me, without looking at me, if I ever regretted not telling them. I considered the question carefully. I thought about the chaos it would have unleashed, the expectations, the justifications. I thought about how easily love could have been confused with access. I told her no, not because they didn't deserve to know, but because I deserved to be known for who I was, not what I had. She nodded, as if that answered something for her, too. As the nonprofit grew, so did my confidence in my decisions. We reached 200 seniors, then more. We trained volunteers, built partnerships. People began to recognize my name in professional circles, not as a winner of anything, but as someone doing steady, meaningful work. It mattered to me more than I expected. Sometimes, late at night, I revisited the memory of that first test, the phone calls, the excuses, the silence. I didn't replay it to reopen wounds. I replayed it to remind myself why my boundaries existed. Boundaries, I learned, weren't walls meant to keep people out. They were lines that showed people how to stay. The money remained mostly untouched, invested in growing quietly, like a promise I didn't rush to cash in. It was there if I needed it. It was there to support causes that aligned with my values, but it no longer defined the arc of my days. In a strange way, winning the lottery had made money less important, not more. What mattered was waking up aligned with myself. What mattered was giving without being emptied. What mattered was knowing that if everything disappeared tomorrow, I would still recognize the person standing in the aftermath. I had started this journey believing money would change my life. Instead, it clarified it. It showed me who would show up when I offered nothing but honesty. It taught me that love without respect is just another transaction, and it gave me the freedom to choose peace over performance. If there is a lesson in my story, it isn't about luck or secrecy. It's about listening to the quiet truths we ignore when we're busy surviving. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't the jackpot itself, it's the silence that follows and what you finally hear within it. As time went on, I realized that peace, once you find it, asks to be protected. It isn't fragile in the way people assume, but it is selective. It thrives in environments where honesty and restraint coexist. I became deliberate about how I spent my time, who had access to me, and how much of my inner life I offered up for consumption. This wasn't bitterness, it was stewardship. There were moments when temptation whispered, moments when I imagined what it would feel like to walk into a family gathering and end every subtle power imbalance with a single sentence, to erase years of judgment and dismissal by revealing that I had not only survived, but surpassed every unspoken metric they'd used to measure worth. But those fantasies always ended the same way in my mind, with noise, not healing, with apologies motivated by self-interest rather than understanding. I learned to let those imaginings pass without feeding them. Instead, I focused on building a life that felt congruent from the inside out. My days took on a gentle rhythm. Mornings for planning and calls, afternoons for visits, sometimes sitting quietly with someone who didn't need to talk at all, evenings for reflection. I started journaling again, something I'd abandoned years earlier when my thoughts felt too heavy to organize. Writing helped me track the subtle shifts in myself, the way my shoulders no longer lived near my ears, the way I laughed more easily, the way I stopped apologizing for taking up space. The nonprofit began receiving attention from local media, nothing sensational, a short feature here, a radio interview there. Each time, I declined to share personal details, redirecting the focus to the seniors and volunteers. I was careful not to let the work become another stage for validation. Purpose, I learned, could be just as addictive as scarcity if you weren't mindful. My relationship with Charlotte deepened in quiet ways. We took long walks after difficult days, debriefing not just logistics but emotions. She asked questions that went beyond surface updates. How are you really doing with all this? What does enough look like for you now? No one had asked me that before. I didn't always have an answer, but the asking itself felt like care. There was a moment, about 2 years after the win, when the past nearly collided with the present. A distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, claiming to have heard rumors about my success. The wording was careful, but the intent was familiar. I felt the old reflex to explain, to justify, to soften. Instead, I responded politely and briefly, declining to engage further. When the conversation fizzled, I felt a small, unexpected pride, not in the boundary itself, but in how natural it had become. Aunt Martha's health declined gradually, the way it often does, no single crisis, just a narrowing of energy. I was there for appointments, for quiet afternoons, for the practical details that accumulate when someone lives alone. One evening, as I helped her into bed, she squeezed my hand and told me she was proud of me, not for the money, she clarified, smiling faintly, for the way I'd handled it, for not letting it harden me. The words stayed with me long after I drove home. When she passed, peacefully, I grieved deeply but without regret. She had known the truth. She had seen me fully. I honored her by expanding the stipend into a permanent scholarship for teachers nearing retirement, named simply after her first name. It felt right. It felt like continuation, not loss. At her small memorial, my family gathered, united by shared history, if not shared understanding. They spoke kindly of her. They spoke kindly to me. No one asked questions they didn't want answers to. As I listened, I realized something had shifted permanently. I no longer needed their approval, and because of that, their presence no longer felt like a test. In the years since, I've come to understand that wealth doesn't reveal character all at once. It amplifies patterns that were already there. It removes excuses. It hands you a mirror and asks what you'll do when survival is no longer your primary concern. For me, the answer was simpler than I expected. I chose a life where generosity was intentional, not coerced, where love wasn't transactional, where silence could be a form of safety rather than secrecy. I still buy a lottery ticket occasionally, out of habit more than hope. I smile at the memory of the woman I was, standing in a small kitchen with trembling hands and an impossible number. I didn't know then that the real prize wasn't the money. It was the permission I finally gave myself to live without proving anything to anyone. And that, more than any jackpot, is what changed everything. With Aunt Martha gone, the world felt quieter in a different way. Not emptier, but altered, like a room after furniture has been moved and your body hasn't yet relearned the space. For a while, I caught myself reaching for my phone to call her, especially when something small happened that would have amused her, a volunteer story, a memory from teaching, a recipe I couldn't quite get right. Grief didn't rush me. It walked beside me, steady and unannounced, and I learned to let it. I also learned that endings have a way of clarifying beginnings. After the memorial, I spent a few weeks reviewing the life I had built with the same care I once reserved for budgets and balance sheets. What was working? What was habit masquerading as purpose? The nonprofit was thriving, but growth had a gravitational pull. More partnerships meant more meetings, more visibility, more opportunities to say yes. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest when my calendar filled too quickly. It was the same sensation I used to feel during tax season, the warning that something essential was being crowded out. So, I did something that would have terrified my earlier self. I slowed the growth deliberately. We capped new intakes for a quarter. We focused on depth rather than scale. I empowered team leads to make decisions without looping me in on everything. I reminded myself that sustainability was not a lack of ambition. It was respect for the work and for the people doing it. My family noticed the changes only in passing. Lisa asked once if I ever thought about going bigger, about turning the nonprofit into something national. I told her maybe someday, but not now. She nodded, distracted, already moving on to the next topic. It struck me then how often I'd mistaken being unseen for being unmistook. In truth, most people were simply absorbed in their own lives. Accepting that freed me from the need to correct their assumptions. There was one conversation, though, that stayed with me. It happened with my mother on a quiet afternoon when she invited me over for coffee. Warren was out. The house felt large and echoing. She spoke about aging, about uncertainty, about how quickly life seemed to move once you crossed a certain threshold. Then she looked at me and said, almost casually, that she worried she hadn't always been fair to me. The comment hung between us, fragile and unadorned. I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't catalog grievances. I simply said I appreciated her saying that. She nodded, relief flickering across her face, and changed the subject. It wasn't a full reckoning. It wasn't an apology shaped the way movies teach us to expect, but it was real in its restraint, and for once, that was enough. That night, I thought about forgiveness, not as absolution, but as release. I had already forgiven my family in the practical sense. I no longer expected them to be what they weren't. What remained was forgiving myself for the years I spent believing that endurance was the price of belonging. I began that work quietly, without ceremony, the way most important things are done. I invested more time in friendships that had grown organically, without obligation, dinners where laughter wasn't measured, conversations where I didn't have to edit myself for palatability. I traveled modestly, choosing places that invited reflection rather than spectacle. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely, and how to be with others without performing. Every so often, someone would ask me, half joking, what I would do if I ever won the lottery. I smiled and gave a vague answer about paying off debts or helping people. The truth stayed mine. It felt less like a secret and more like a private language I shared with myself, a reminder of what I had survived and what I had chosen instead. Looking back, I understand now that the test I ran wasn't really about them. It was about me, about whether I would continue to measure love by sacrifice or whether I would finally believe that I was worthy of care without collateral. The money didn't make that decision for me. It simply gave me the space to see it clearly. If there's anything I hope listeners take from my story, it's this. Abundance doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an ending or a pause or a truth you've been avoiding. And when it does, the bravest thing you can do is listen, set your boundaries, and build a life that doesn't require you to disappear in order to belong. By the time 5 years had passed since the lottery win, the memory of that night in my kitchen felt distant, like a photograph that had faded around the edges, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had been absorbed into the larger story of who I was. I no longer marked time as before and after the win. I marked it by quieter milestones. The first senior who told me she felt seen again. The first volunteer who stayed longer than scheduled just to listen. The first morning I woke up and realized anxiety was no longer the default setting of my mind. The nonprofit had settled into a sustainable rhythm. We weren't the largest organization in the state, and we didn't need to be. We were known for consistency, for treating people like individuals rather than numbers. I took pride in that. It mirrored the way I had learned to live, intentionally, without spectacle. Charlotte eventually stepped into an executive role, freeing me to focus on mentorship and long-term planning. Watching her grow into leadership was its own kind of reward. Occasionally, I was invited to speak at conferences about social impact and nonprofit governance. I accepted selectively. When I spoke, I talked about systems and boundaries, about the danger of building organizations around burnout and savior narratives. I never mentioned the lottery. People assumed I was another former corporate professional who'd chased meaning after financial stability. They weren't entirely wrong. They just didn't know the full sequence. My family gatherings remained cordial. Jason stabilized, holding a steady job and attending meetings regularly. He thanked me once, vaguely, for always believing he'd get there. I didn't correct the narrative. Lisa's children grew, their lives filling her in ways I couldn't compete with or resented. My parents downsized. The lake house sold quietly after too many maintenance issues. Life, it turned out, had a way of leveling everyone eventually. There was a moment during a holiday dinner when Aunt Heather made an offhand comment about people who got lucky and didn't know how to manage it. Her tone was sharp, her eyes scanning the table. I met her gaze calmly and said nothing. For the first time, her words slid past me without leaving a mark. That was when I knew the work I'd done on myself was real. I began mentoring younger women entering finance and nonprofit work, women who reminded me of my earlier self, competent, conscientious, quietly exhausted. I told them what I wished someone had told me, that generosity without boundaries becomes resentment, that saying no is a skill, not a moral failure, that your worth is not measured by how much inconvenience you're willing to endure. Watching them absorb these ideas, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with visible relief, felt like closing a loop. In quieter moments, I reflected on the role secrecy had played in my story. Secrecy is often framed as deception, but for me, it had been protection. It allowed me to observe without interference, to act without expectation. It gave me the space to disentangle love from leverage. I don't recommend secrecy as a lifestyle. I recommend discernment. There is a difference. The money remained, quietly doing what money does when managed responsibly, growing, supporting, enabling. I drew from it thoughtfully, never impulsively. It was a tool, not an identity. When people asked me what success looked like now, I told them it was alignment, waking up and recognizing my life as my own. One evening, alone in my living room, I pulled out the old lottery ticket I'd kept in a small envelope. I held it for a long time, not with nostalgia, but with gratitude. That piece of paper had changed the trajectory of my life, yes, but the real change had come from the decisions I made after, the choice to test, to observe, to set boundaries, to give without erasing myself. I thought about all the versions of me that could have emerged from that moment, the resentful one, the reckless one, the isolated one. I felt compassion for them all. Then I folded the ticket back into its envelope and put it away, knowing I no longer needed the reminder. If my story sounds quiet compared to the dramatic arcs we're used to hearing, that's intentional. Real transformation often is. It doesn't announce itself. It integrates. It shows up in how you respond when old patterns try to reassert themselves and fail. I didn't end up with a louder life. I ended up with a truer one. And in the end, that's what the jackpot gave me. Not wealth, but the clarity to stop living on credit with my own well-being. As I moved deeper into my 40s, I noticed something unexpected. The story no longer felt like something that had happened to me. It felt like something I had participated in consciously, even co-authored. That distinction mattered. It meant I no longer framed my past as a series of events that shaped me without consent, but as a sequence of choices I had made, sometimes imperfectly, always with the information I had at the time. The nonprofit reached a point where it could function smoothly without my daily involvement. That transition was both gratifying and unsettling. For years, purpose had structured my time. Letting go of operational control forced me to ask questions I'd been postponing. What did I want my days to look like now, beyond responsibility? What brought me joy when no one was watching? I rediscovered small pleasures I'd abandoned during years of survival mode: morning walks without headphones, cooking meals that took time, not because I was impressing anyone, but because the process itself was calming, reading novels that had nothing to do with self-improvement or strategy. These were not indulgences. They were acts of reclamation. I also began therapy, not out of crisis, but out of curiosity. I wanted to understand the patterns that had once felt inevitable. The therapist helped me name things I'd normalized: hyperindependence, overfunctioning, the reflex to preempt disappointment by lowering expectations. Naming them didn't erase them, but it loosened their grip. It gave me language, and language, I learned, is a form of power. My family continued to orbit at a respectful distance. There were birthdays and holidays and the occasional group message. The emotional temperature remained mild. For a long time, I thought this neutrality meant something was missing. Then I realized it meant something was stable. We were no longer reenacting old roles. We were simply people who shared history. There was one moment, years after the win, when I came close to telling the truth. It happened during a conversation with Lisa after her children had gone to bed. She spoke candidly about financial pressure, about the invisible expectations of maintaining a certain image. For a brief second, I imagined telling her that money was not the solution she thought it was, that it came with its own tests. I imagined offering reassurance backed by resources. But I stopped, not out of fear, but out of respect for the boundary I'd set and for her own journey. Some lessons can't be outsourced. I listened instead, and when we hugged goodbye, I felt no regret. I began to think more intentionally about legacy, not in terms of inheritance, but in terms of impact. What stories would remain after I was gone? What structures would continue to serve others without my presence? I worked with advisors to ensure the charitable trust would endure, governed by values rather than personalities. It felt like planting trees whose shade I might never sit under. Occasionally, I encountered stories of lottery winners whose lives imploded, and people would shake their heads and say how tragic it was. I understood the tragedy differently. It wasn't the money, it was the absence of boundaries, the sudden amplification of unresolved dynamics. Wealth doesn't create dysfunction, it removes the friction that once kept it contained. When I spoke to younger audiences, I emphasized this point gently. I told them that the most important financial decision they'd ever make wasn't about investment vehicles or returns. It was about self-knowledge, about understanding what they were trying to prove and to whom. Money, in that sense, was just a mirror. My own reflection had changed. I no longer saw someone bracing for impact. I saw someone at ease with complexity, capable of holding gratitude and grief, generosity and restraint in the same hands. That balance had taken time. It had taken mistakes. It had taken silence. One evening, as I sat alone watching the sun set through my living room window, I felt a deep, unremarkable contentment. No adrenaline, no triumph, just steadiness. I thought about the version of myself who once believed happiness was something you earned through endurance. I wish I could tell her that happiness could also be cultivated through choice. The lottery ticket, the test, the secrecy, those were chapters, not the conclusion. The conclusion, if there is one, is ongoing. It's written every day in how I respond to the world, how I allocate my attention, and how I honor my own limits. If you're listening to this and wondering what you would do in my place, my answer is simpler than you might expect. I would tell you to listen closely to how people treat you when there is nothing in it for them, to notice how you treat yourself when no one is watching, and to remember that the quietest outcomes are often the most enduring. As the years continued, I noticed a subtle but profound shift in how I experienced relationships and time. Life, which had once felt like a series of obligations and tests, began to stretch out in a way that allowed me to see its textures. I noticed the small gestures that actually mattered, the way a volunteer remembered a senior's birthday, the way Charlotte would pause mid-conversation just to make sure I was holding up, the way a neighbor waved from their porch because they recognized the effort it took to maintain kindness in small doses. These moments had no fanfare, no cameras, no accolades, but they were real, and they anchored me more deeply than any lottery winnings ever could. The nonprofit had become more than a job or even a calling. It was a lens through which I understood generosity, loyalty, and human nature. I watched people navigate adversity with grace, and I watched others stumble when they thought they were invincible. I began to appreciate the difference between giving because you have resources and giving because your heart insists it's right. The former is transactional, the latter is transformative, and I realized that my life, in its quiet rhythm, was built on that second form. Even my casual encounters became exercises in awareness. A young cashier who seemed overwhelmed, a bus driver humming quietly to themselves, a coworker struggling with a task. I began to observe without judgment, offering small gestures of acknowledgement or patience. In doing so, I noticed the subtle ways the world had shifted when you operate from a place of grounded security rather than scarcity-fueled anxiety. I had once measured my worth by how much I sacrificed, but now I measured it by how consistently I could extend grace without self-erasure. Of course, old patterns occasionally resurfaced. Jason would sometimes drift into my life with stories of financial tight spots or personal crises. For a moment, my reflex was to give, to step in and rescue, as I had done in the past. But years of careful practice taught me that giving isn't always about responding immediately. Sometimes it's about observing, about letting people confront their own choices while providing a safety net when appropriate. When I helped him pay for rehab years ago, I had learned that generosity without discernment could be co-opted. Now the act was deliberate, necessary, without expectation. That distinction made all the difference. Lisa continued to lead her busy, carefully constructed life. Occasionally, she reached out to share milestones or seek advice on matters she considered within her comfort zone. I listened. I offered insight when it felt appropriate, but I no longer experienced the pang of imbalance when she recounted her achievements. I had created an internal ledger where love, attention, and generosity were not currency. That inner freedom was, I realized, more valuable than any amount of money. My parents aged in quiet ways. Gregory developed a rhythm with retirement that included gardening and local volunteer work. Diane found ways to channel her energy into philanthropy, though it remained performative at times. Watching them, I felt no resentment, just understanding. Their choices were their own, and mine were entirely separate. I realized that detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means the ability to hold love without anxiety or expectation. During this period, I also became more intentional with time, a resource far more finite than money. I began keeping weekends sacred, dedicated to rest, reading, and reflection. I traveled sparingly, not seeking luxury but meaningful experiences. One trip brought me to a coastal town where I spent days walking along cliffs and listening to the ocean. I brought nothing but a notebook, pen, and camera. I wrote letters I would never send, capturing thoughts and gratitude that might otherwise slip away. These rituals, simple as they were, cultivated a calm I had never known during my years of survival mode living. I still occasionally reflect on the original test I devised, the one that revealed who would help me when I had nothing to offer. It feels strange to call it a test now. At the time, it was tinged with exhaustion, a need for clarity after decades of one-sided giving. In hindsight, it was a masterstroke in self-preservation. 9 people failed, not because they were malicious, but because human nature often defaults to self-interest, fear, or distraction. Aunt Martha alone passed without hesitation. That singular truth anchored my understanding of loyalty. It became a principle that guided all decisions. Invest your love where it will be recognized and reciprocated in principle, if not in kind. Financially, I remained deliberate. I never flaunted wealth. I never allowed it to dictate my identity. I continued funding the charitable trust, supporting initiatives that aligned with my values, and quietly assisting those who needed help without making them dependent. Each transaction, each allocation was guided by reflection rather than impulse. I discovered that freedom isn't about the capacity to buy everything. It's about the ability to choose wisely without compulsion or guilt. Romantically, I approached relationships differently. I had dated sporadically after the win, but the experiences were nothing like before. I refused to compromise on boundaries. I refused to chase validation. Instead, I sought companionship that mirrored the clarity I had cultivated within myself. Partners were welcome to enter my life, but never at the expense of my autonomy or integrity. I realized the quality of connection mattered infinitely more than quantity or convenience. Even holidays became different. I didn't travel for obligation. I didn't attend family dinners where past slights would inevitably be aired. I visited Aunt Martha's bungalow when she was alive, sometimes alone, sometimes with Charlotte. We would cook, laugh quietly, and share stories that required no justification. Those were my celebrations, intimate, deliberate, and unburdened by expectation. After her passing, I carried on the tradition, alone, honoring the spirit she had modeled, generosity that is measured, intentional, and unselfish. One spring, I met a senior named Eleanor through the nonprofit. She was 84, sharp-minded, and stubborn. At first, she resisted companionship. She insisted she didn't need anyone and scoffed at our volunteer matches. But over weeks, she began to open, sharing stories of her late husband, her childhood, and her small victories and regrets. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't judge. I simply bore witness. When she finally hugged me one afternoon, whispering, "Thank you for seeing me," I understood the depth of what I had been building. Money had facilitated it, but it was the intention, patience, and consistency that made it profound. As I reflected on my life, I realized that every choice, from secrecy to giving, from boundaries to patience, was a deliberate act of authorship. I was no longer a character in someone else's story of expectation or judgment. I was writing my own narrative, quietly and purposefully. The jackpot was never the ending. It was the catalyst, the signal, the opportunity. What I did with it defined the story, not the numbers themselves. And in the quiet of that reflection, I came to understand the full measure of the lesson I had learned. Money has power, but it does not have wisdom. Love has depth, but it cannot be coerced. Peace has value, but it must be defended gently and deliberately. Freedom isn't merely the absence of constraint, it is the presence of clarity and self-respect. I often imagine telling my younger self, the 34-year-old sitting on the kitchen floor staring at the impossible numbers, that winning the lottery wasn't the miracle. The miracle was the permission to live deliberately, to observe quietly, to give and withhold thoughtfully, to love without erasure, and to discover that real abundance exists in alignment with your own values, not in the approval of others. And in the quiet of that reflection, I came to understand the full measure of the lesson I had learned. Money has power, but it does not have wisdom. Love has depth, but it cannot be coerced. Peace has value, but it must be defended gently and deliberately. Freedom isn't merely the absence of constraint, it is the presence of clarity and self-respect. By the time a decade had passed since that life-altering night, the lottery ticket felt more like a relic than a memory. I kept it tucked away, folded carefully in an envelope, not for nostalgia, but as a quiet reminder of the threshold I had crossed, where possibility met choice and fear met clarity. I rarely thought about the exact sum or the what-ifs of what I might have done differently. Those numbers had been the opening of a door. Everything beyond it was the work I had chosen to do inside the room it revealed. Life settled into rhythms that were simple and intentional. I no longer felt the persistent hum of scarcity that had haunted me for years. Money, once a source of stress and anxiety, became a tool, entirely subordinate to values and purpose. I funded the nonprofit, yes, but I also ensured that every expenditure was thoughtful. Every grant and donation had a story. I met regularly with Charlotte to review initiatives, but we also discussed well-being, personal growth, and long-term vision. It was rare to find a space where professionalism and humanity coexisted so seamlessly, and I cherished it fiercely. The seniors we served became a living extension of my own reflection. I remember Eleanor, the 84-year-old who had resisted companionship, now thriving in her routine with a volunteer she adored. And there were others, hundreds of quiet stories that layered into a mosaic of resilience and gratitude. In listening to them, I learned as much as I taught. The conversations were never dramatic, never sensational, but they were rich, carrying lessons about patience, dignity, and the small but profound ways humans care for one another. Occasionally, my family drifted back into my orbit. Jason had stabilized, and though we still weren't close, I felt no urgency to chase connection. Lisa's family life remained busy and beautiful in its curated way. My parents had aged gracefully, managing their lives with practical routines and occasional surprises. I noticed them, appreciated them, and accepted them exactly as they were, neither idealized nor rejected. The same went for Aunt Heather. I continued to keep polite distance. Observing without interference had become second nature. The old tension, the need to prove worth, had dissipated entirely. I also reflected on the relationships that mattered most. Charlotte remained my closest confidant. We celebrated milestones quietly, supporting one another without performance or expectation. Aunt Martha's memory remained a compass. Her approach to life, modesty, generosity without demand, contentment with what is, had left a permanent imprint on my understanding of loyalty, love, and wisdom. I often told volunteers stories about her, not as lessons, but as examples of quiet courage. The idea of money testing character had become a touchstone in my reflections. That first experiment, my simulated financial emergency, had been a harsh but necessary clarity. 9 out of 10 had faltered, and Aunt Martha had shone. Over time, I realized the test hadn't just revealed who would show up. It revealed who I had allowed myself to rely on emotionally and who I had neglected to protect from the burdens of my generosity. I had misunderstood the dynamics for years, seeing love as something earned by sacrifice. The test showed me that love is best recognized when it flows freely without strings attached. and that boundaries are not betrayals, but declarations of self-respect. I also came to see that wealth, handled thoughtfully, magnified human truth. Those who were inclined toward empathy and generosity remained so. Those driven by entitlement or self-interest revealed themselves more clearly. The lottery didn't corrupt my family, it simply removed the smoke and mirrors that had previously obscured patterns. I could observe without illusion, I could act without compulsion, and, most importantly, I could exist without constantly negotiating validation from those who would never have provided it unconditionally. Romantically, my approach evolved too. I dated, but cautiously and intentionally. I wanted someone who could engage as an equal, who respected autonomy, and who understood that love wasn't transactional. Those relationships were rare, but when they occurred, they were steady, grounded, and nourishing. I no longer sought fulfillment through external approval, and as a result, connections became healthier, more real, and deeper than they had ever been before. One summer, I took a retreat for myself, leaving Portland for a quiet coastal town. I spent mornings walking along cliffs, evenings writing in journals that had become a repository for reflection, gratitude, and planning. I took no calls, answered no emails, and let myself exist fully in the rhythm of time as it came, not as I dictated. That solitude, unmarked by urgency or expectation, became one of the most profound teachers of my life. It reminded me that clarity requires silence, and that peace is cultivated through intentional attention to the self, not merely through avoidance of chaos. I also began mentoring a small circle of women who reminded me of my younger self. They were conscientious, overextended, and often struggling to balance expectations with self-care. I shared lessons I had learned the hard way, that generosity without boundaries leads to depletion, that saying no is a form of protection rather than selfishness, that life's measure is not in sacrifice alone, but in the integrity with which one lives and loves. Watching them internalize these ideas, even partially, filled me with a quiet satisfaction. I realized that one of the most enduring forms of wealth is the ability to shape lives through wisdom rather than finances. By now, the original lottery win had become almost a metaphor more than a fact in my day-to-day existence. It had created a space for transformation, but I no longer defined myself through it. I measured my life in alignment, choices, and relationships rather than numbers. Yet, occasionally, I would think back to that first night of disbelief, the shock, the uncertainty, the silent calculation of what to do next. I realized that the real shock had not been the money itself, but the clarity it demanded and the responsibility to act in alignment with my values. During holidays, I continued small traditions that honored Aunt Martha. I invited volunteers or neighbors over for simple dinners, meals designed not for spectacle, but for connection. Charlotte sometimes joined, her laughter filling gaps that had once been occupied by anxiety or self-doubt. These gatherings were never large, never performative, but they became the real measure of celebration. I no longer compared them to family expectations or societal norms. They were complete simply because they were authentic. Financially, I maintained discretion. I never flaunted wealth, never allowed it to dictate my identity. Gifts were thoughtful, discreet, and aligned with needs rather than desires. The charitable trust became a quiet force, supporting causes without fanfare. It ensured that the energy of my win, the possibility it created, remained active in the world, touching lives in small but meaningful ways. The power of choice, I realized, was more significant than the magnitude of resources. By the time I turned 45, I understood fully that the jackpot had never been a story of luck. It was a story of consequence. It was a mirror. It forced me to confront my values, test loyalty, and set boundaries. It allowed me to choose my life deliberately, and in doing so, revealed that the greatest form of wealth is not money, it is clarity, peace, and the freedom to live authentically. Sitting in my living room on a quiet evening, looking at sunlight fading into a soft twilight, I realized that the narrative of my life had shifted from survival to authorship. I had built a life where generosity, love, and integrity coexisted without compromise. I had cultivated peace without isolation. I had nurtured purpose without performance. And in that quiet, deliberate life, I found something far more lasting than any fortune, a profound sense of self that could neither be taken nor diminished. For anyone listening, I hope this story illustrates something essential. Real abundance isn't always about what you acquire, it's about what you cultivate: clarity, boundaries, empathy, and intentionality. Money can provide opportunities, but it can't provide wisdom. It can amplify truth, but it can't teach you patience or self-respect. The jackpot for me was never the point. The point was what I chose to do with it, and how those choices reflected the life I wanted to live when no one was watching. The final lesson, the one that settled into me like a slow tide, is simple. Test character gently, guard your boundaries firmly, and live in a way that doesn't demand recognition for kindness. Love freely, but do not erase yourself in the process. Be patient, be deliberate, and remember that the quiet victories, consistency, integrity, compassion, are often the ones that endure longest. And in that understanding, I finally felt complete. With each passing year, I grew more attuned to the subtleties of my life, the way decisions, once urgent and loaded with fear, could be handled with calm discernment, the way relationships, once fraught with expectation, could exist in clarity and respect. I no longer felt tethered to the anxieties of scarcity, nor compelled to perform generosity in a way that exhausted me. Money, which had once been both a lifeline and liability, had become a quiet facilitator, a tool for intentional living rather than a measuring stick for worth or influence. The nonprofit continued to be the center of my daily rhythm, but it evolved organically. We began creating mentorship programs, pairing young volunteers with isolated seniors, not just for companionship, but to foster intergenerational understanding. I watched as volunteers learned patience and empathy, and seniors felt seen and valued. These interactions, small as they seemed, became my anchor. They were my proof that impact need not be loud or public to be meaningful. Each smile, each moment of acknowledgement, each story shared in trust became a thread weaving together purpose and fulfillment. Charlotte remained my constant. Over the years, our friendship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. She had seen me in both my hesitancy and my growth and had never judged either. We often reflected together on how lives could be transformed through seemingly minor acts of intention. Our conversations meandered from nonprofit strategy to philosophy to personal reflection to what it meant to live ethically in a world that constantly tests patience and integrity. Her presence reminded me that meaningful connection thrives when honesty is prioritized over approval. I also noticed that my family's presence in my life had shifted from expectation to observation. Jason had found stability, and our interactions were civil but distant. Lisa and her family continued their busy routines, and while I cared for them deeply, I no longer felt compelled to insert myself into their crises. My parents aged quietly, managing their lives with their habitual mix of pragmatism and occasional eccentricity. I observed them with empathy, appreciating them for who they were without allowing their limitations to dictate my emotional state. Aunt Heather remained distant, still sharp in her opinions, but I felt no need to respond. Over time, the boundaries I had established became second nature, protecting my energy and preserving my inner peace. Romantically, I had learned lessons that were both humbling and empowering. I dated selectively, never allowing a relationship to compromise my values or boundaries. I sought companions who were aligned with the principles I had cultivated: mutual respect, emotional responsibility, and willingness to navigate life's complexities without manipulation. These experiences, though few, were profound. I realized that the richest connections are not forged through dependence, but through partnership, and that love must enhance rather than consume one's sense of self. Travel became another avenue for reflection. I visited quiet coastal towns, forest retreats, and small villages where life moved slowly and intentionally. I carried journals and cameras, recording observations and thoughts, sometimes sharing them in workshops with volunteers or mentees. These journeys were not for status, but for insight. They offered a perspective that reminded me of the vastness of the world, the diversity of human experience, and the quiet beauty of lives lived authentically without the constant pressure to perform or impress. I often thought about the original lottery test, the one that had revealed the true measure of loyalty and generosity within my family. With hindsight, I recognized that it had been less about them and more about me, about learning to differentiate love from expectation, support from self-interest, and boundaries from rejection. Aunt Martha's unhesitating response had provided a template for living. Generosity is meaningful when offered freely, without coercion, and should be received without exploitation. The insight shaped every subsequent decision, from financial management to personal interactions. Financially, I maintained discretion. I continued to fund the charitable trust, supporting initiatives that aligned with my values. I assisted those in genuine need quietly, ensuring that help did not create dependency or compromise dignity. I avoided ostentation. I avoided spectacle. Wealth, I had discovered, is best honored through thoughtful action, not public display. Its power lies not in flaunting abundance, but in its capacity to enable intentional, ethical choices. One of the most profound realizations during this period was understanding the relationship between silence and clarity. Early in the journey, secrecy was necessary to protect both the fortune and the emotional equilibrium it created. Over time, silence evolved into a practice, a form of introspection, a space to evaluate motives, a buffer against impulsive reactions. It was in these quiet moments that I found the clarity to act with integrity, to invest energy wisely, and to nurture relationships that were genuine and reciprocal. I continued to mentor younger women, particularly those entering the fields of finance and nonprofit management. These women reminded me of my younger self, competent, diligent, and quietly anxious under pressure. I shared lessons I had learned the hard way: how to navigate generosity without depletion, how to maintain boundaries without guilt, how to align actions with values rather than expectations. Watching them internalize these lessons, I recognized that one of the most enduring forms of influence is not financial, but intellectual and ethical. This, I realized, was a form of legacy more enduring than wealth itself. During quiet evenings, I would reflect on the long arc of my life since the lottery win. What struck me most was not the fortune itself, but the freedom it facilitated. The freedom to observe without interference, to give without expectation, to make deliberate choices about how to live. I no longer measured life by scarcity or validation. I measured it by alignment, presence, and impact. This perspective reshaped every interaction, every decision, every emotional response. One particularly memorable evening, I sat on my porch with a notebook, reflecting on the path I had chosen. I traced the trajectory from the anxious, overextended woman I had once been to the person I had become: disciplined, deliberate, generous, and at peace. I realized that true transformation is not about sudden change, but about consistent choices over time. It is the accumulation of deliberate actions guided by values rather than impulse that ultimately shapes character and life. By this point, I understood that the true value of the lottery was never monetary. The money had created possibilities, but it was the choices that followed, how to act, who to trust, how to give, that defined the trajectory of my life. The jackpot had been a catalyst, but not the destination. My real wealth was clarity, understanding who I am, what I value, and how I wish to live. It was the freedom to navigate life without the distortions of fear, expectation, or obligation. And so I continued, quietly, deliberately, and authentically. I maintained relationships with care, nurtured the nonprofit, observed my family without attachment, and honored the lessons of loyalty, generosity, and self-respect that had emerged from the earliest, most intense moments of the lottery's impact. Life was not perfect. People made mistakes, systems faltered, and challenges arose. But I had cultivated resilience, discernment, and a grounded sense of self that carried me through with equanimity. In the stillness of reflection, I realized that this was the culmination of everything I had learned, that money can illuminate truth but cannot create it, that generosity is meaningful only when tempered by boundaries, that love is richest when freely given, and that peace is the reward of integrity and self-knowledge. The jackpot, the secrecy, the tests, they had all been instruments teaching me lessons I might never have learned otherwise. And now, in the quiet of my home, as the sun sets and the world softens into evening, I can say without hesitation that I am whole. Not because of money, not because of recognition, not because of anyone's approval, but because I have learned to live deliberately, act ethically, and love without sacrificing myself. The path has been long, sometimes painful, often uncertain, but it has brought me here, grounded, clear, and free. Sitting in my quiet living room, I sometimes marvel at the trajectory of my life, the improbable moment when a $10 lottery ticket transformed everything, yet in ways I never expected. I once thought that wealth would solve problems, that it would bring me happiness and recognition. But over the years, I've learned that the true gift wasn't the money itself. It was the clarity, the freedom, and the opportunity to see people and myself without the distortions of need, fear, or obligation. In these final years, I have come to understand what abundance really means. It isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the quality of presence and intention. I see it in the laughter of volunteers who have found purpose through our nonprofit, in the quiet gratitude of seniors who feel acknowledged, in the steady companionship of Charlotte and the warmth of friends who require nothing in return. These are the treasures that have shaped my life, far more enduring than any sum of money could provide. I reflect on my family, with all their flaws, their missed opportunities, their occasional generosity, and frequent self-interest. I have made peace with them, not because they changed, but because I did. I no longer expect apologies or acknowledgement. I no longer seek validation from those unwilling to give it freely. I observe them. I care where it matters, and I act where it feels right, but always within boundaries that protect my integrity. That, I have learned, is true love, a form of care that neither erodes nor depends upon self-sacrifice. The lessons from Aunt Martha remain vivid. Her life, modest yet full of quiet dignity, continues to guide me. She showed me that generosity can coexist with restraint, that happiness is not contingent on wealth, and that self-respect is the truest measure of character. Her memory shapes every act I undertake, every decision I make, and every boundary I maintain. She taught me that the right life is built not in spectacle, but in consistency, kindness, and reflection. In my own life, I have discovered the power of discernment. I no longer allow fear or expectation to dictate my actions. I give where it matters, I invest my energy wisely, and I honor my own needs with the same care I extend to others. The test I once devised to reveal loyalty now feels like a metaphor for life itself. Character shows itself when there is nothing to gain, and love shines brightest when it flows freely. I carry that insight in every interaction, every choice, every quiet morning. The nonprofit has become a legacy of intention. It is designed to continue beyond me, to support people quietly and meaningfully, without reliance on recognition or spectacle. I have built systems that reflect values rather than ego, and in doing so, I have learned one of the most important truths of all. Influence is not measured by wealth or power, but by consistency, integrity, and the ability to lift others while remaining grounded in oneself. I also cherish solitude now, not as loneliness, but as a space for reflection and growth. I write in journals, take walks along familiar streets, and sometimes sit for hours just observing the play of light across my garden. These moments are as vital as any grand adventure. They remind me that life is composed of ordinary experiences, and depth is found in attention, not spectacle. Occasionally, someone asks me what it was like to win the lottery. I smile and give a vague answer because the story isn't about numbers, it's about transformation. It's about learning to navigate life deliberately, to recognize who deserves your trust, to give freely without erasing yourself, and to find peace in alignment with your values. The money opened the door, but the real journey, resilience, clarity, and self-knowledge, was mine to walk. I have finally come to understand that happiness, stability, and purpose are not external rewards. They are cultivated through choice, reflection, and integrity. They are found in the quiet moments of care, in relationships nurtured without expectation, in the deliberate actions that honor both self and others. These are the true jackpots of life, the ones that endure long after the lottery numbers fade from memory. As I sit here, the evening light soft across the walls, I feel a profound sense of completeness. The woman I once was, the one anxious, overextended, and weighed down by expectation, would scarcely recognize me. And yet she would be proud. She would see that her efforts, her endurance, her choices led to a life that is grounded, intentional, and deeply human. So, to anyone listening, wealth is fleeting, but clarity is permanent. Generosity without boundaries can deplete, but discerned kindness can transform. Love, when freely given and wisely guarded, is abundant and enduring. And peace, true peace, comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the mastery of self, the cultivation of values, and the courage to live authentically. The lottery was never the story, it was only the beginning. The real story was what came after. The choices, the boundaries, the revelations, the quiet moments of insight, and the life intentionally lived. That is the legacy I carry. That is the truth I offer. And in that quiet clarity, I have found everything I ever sought: freedom, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that I am enough, just as I am. The room grows darker as night falls, but I feel no fear. The world is soft around me, and I am present. I am alive. I am whole. And that, after all the tests, all the silence, all the years of reflection and growth, is the real jackpot. The journey is complete, yet ongoing, a quiet testament to the life I chose to build, deliberate, generous, and true.